I'm Michiaki Kai from Japan, the professor of Nippon Buri University, and also main commission member.
Yeah, I'm the co-chair at Waller, and I'm from Ontario Tech University, where I'm an industrial research chair in health physics and environmental safety.
This session discusses optimization of protection in emergency and recovery process. And previous session broadened optimization and very interesting discussion, and we continue discuss the optimization, emergency and recovery. I'd like to first speaker to take stage, Dr. Jean-François Leconte. He's a member of IRSN and also the former ICRP committee for member, the current emeritus committee for member. And he talked about ICRP recommendation workers and responders. Please.
Thank you very much, Michiaki, for this kind introduction. Good morning, everybody. In 10 minutes, I will try to solve the issue. What is the issue is workers and responders in case of after an accident. What is the situation in such a case? First, the accident is a breaking. It is an unforeseen event. We have a lack of experience of such event, even Fukushima and Chernobyl. There are many uncertainties. We are no more in a normal situation in such a case. Then the responders should be adequately protected. This protection is inspired by those of workers in normal situation, but according to specific requisites. And we need a graded approach. And in this graded approach, ICRP recommends to make two distinctions. First, in space, I mean on-site, which is a damage as installation, versus off-site, which is the affected area, and in time, according to the three phases of the emergency and response: early, intermediate, and long-term phase. This picture is coming from a Japanese book related to workers in the nuclear plant. What is there to do? It is depending on the phase and also on where we are. In the early phase, on site, we need to implement urgent action to limit damage and to regain control. Off-site, we implement early countermeasures for the protection people of the environment, and we start to make measurement and monitoring. In the intermediate phase, on-site, we start the decontamination of the installation, and off-site, we start the characterization of the situation, and we continue the first recovery action, I mean decontamination, infrastructure restoration, and so on. In the long-term phase, the picture is changed. On-site, the issue is to dismantle the damaged installation and to manage the related waste. And off-site, there is also a work of decontamination of land, buildings, and so on, and also to support the long-term protective action and in order to improve the living conditions. You can see it is a huge work. Who are the responders? In the early and intermediate phases, on site, there are mainly workers from the damaged installation, plus some workers coming from outside as helpers. And there is a key recommendation coming from ICRP is to have in advance some dedicated teams of specially trained workers. It could help in case of. Off-site, during these two first phases, we have different types of responders. First, emergency teams, I mean firemen, policemen, and so on. You have what I call common workers, such as bus driver, civil engineer, and so on, and other people who are not workers, who could be elected representatives, volunteers, and so on, NGOs, citizens, and so on. In the long-term phase, on-site, we have different types of workers being present for their skills and making their job under radiation. Off-site, the characterization is to have many types of responders. It could be emergency teams, it could be municipal workers for the decontamination, it could be skilled workers for some type of work, it could be citizens, and so on. What is at stake in the ICRP jargon? What are the prevailing circumstances? In the early and intermediate phases, the source is out of control. It is a key point in terms of radiation protection. Those could be potentially high, especially on site. Working conditions are unprecedented, they are difficult. Responders may intervene close to the population when we are off-site. And globally, we have a lack of radiation protection culture for many responders. In the long-term phase, on-site, the source is mostly under control. Also, some technical difficulties may appear, and we could have also unforeseen situations which need to some reaction. Off-site, as I said, the characteristic is mixed teams, often also mixed with the population. Now, setting the scene, how to protect the responders? As I said, there are many types of responders. All are not workers. When they are workers, some are know how to work under radiation, others not. Then we have such a diversity. ICRP recommends to use the term responders for all of them. The recommendation is to manage these responders like workers in normal situation, but according to the prevailing circumstances, and then it is in a specific way. This specific way should be sufficiently flexible and while keeping some caution. More concretely, this protection is based on the principle of optimization. And this optimization is itself based on the numerical tool, which is reference level. And the total dose, total exposure of responders for all activities should be guided by the reference level of 100 millisieverts for the duration of their intervention during the early and intermediate phases. It could be some exceptional circumstances in which we could go above, but for a limited number of responders. And after, in the late phase, then we can, the danger is less, and we can have a number which are decreasing. And we also have to provide decent working and housing conditions because of the stressful and difficult condition of work. This table is summarizing the reference level. In the framework, it is for responders. You can see that in early and intermediate phase on-site, it is 100. But if responders intervene in both phases, it is still 100 for both phases. In the long-term phase, we can have a reference level of 20 per year or below. And in off-site, it is 100 for the early, 20 millisieverts per year or below for the intermediate phase. And during the late phase, it depends if they are working together in a place not open to the public, it is 20 millisieverts per year. If there is some intervention together with members of the population, we need to have a consistent protection and consistent numbers. I add that during the long-term phase on-site, ICRP also provide the possibility to have a specific status, a kind of exemption if there are some difficulties non-expected. Again, this picture coming from the same book, and I tried in 10 minutes to summarize a very complex issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like the next speaker to take a stage. Oishi Nair that developed the preparedness report for post-nuclear accident recovery. Dr. Chris Moore. He talked about title, the preparedness for post-nuclear accident recovery, NUA radiological protection guidance applicable at national level. Please.
Thank you, Kai-san. Hello, everyone, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to highlight some of the work of the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency on recovery preparedness. As Kai-san said, my name is Chris Morgan. I'm a radiological protection specialist at the NEA. I'm also scientific secretary for our working party on nuclear emergency matters, and even in a previous role, I was secretary for our national recovery working group in the UK, working for the Environment Agency there. Okay, so today I'm going to very briefly highlight what we mean by recovery and why preparedness for recovery is important. I'm going to briefly introduce the NEA's recovery framework as a form of guidance for national recovery preparedness, and lastly, briefly introduce our next international nuclear emergency exercise, INEX 6, which is where we will test the longer-term recovery phase. Okay, so the NEA's recovery framework is focused largely on the longer-term phase, where the termination of the emergency has taken place and those response phase actions are no longer required. The transition between the response phase and the recovery phase, which ICRP often relates to as the intermediate phase, is dealt with in several publications, including ICRP Publication 146 and IAEA GSG 11. It's important to note that planning for the transition phase is now seen as a prerequisite within many countries' national legislation and recovery regimes. However, preparedness for the longer-term recovery phase is largely not set out in legislation, only in guidance, and this is something that I would hope to see change within the review of the system in the next phase and in the future. So in terms of what is at stake in terms of recovery, there's many issues, many impacts that can be aided by preparedness. Some of those, as you can see on screen, are loss of livelihood, decline in infrastructure, societal issues, environmental consequences, so that includes things like ecosystem services, lack of preparedness for remediation of inhabited areas, affected communities that may lose trust. And understanding all of these issues are really important and a good baseline in terms of advising, informing your recovery preparedness moving forward. Okay, so earlier this year, the NEA published our guidance, building a framework for post-nuclear accident recovery preparedness, and this was supported by a launch webinar in May of this year. About 2 weeks ago, we also held a 2-day workshop hosted by our colleagues in IRSN in France, and that one gave us an opportunity to explore the framework in more detail, go into a bit more of the detail in terms of the topics and what's important with recovery preparedness, and those materials will be made available on our website in case you are interested on that one. The next phase, which I'll touch upon in later slides, is the INEX exercise, where we will be focusing on this longer-term recovery. So the framework itself is aimed mainly at national governments and policymakers who really need to put in the underpinning, the foundation arrangements for the recovery within their country. As part of that, it's also mainly aimed at all countries, so it's regardless of their current levels of recovery preparedness, and it's even the most advanced countries can learn from the recovery framework because of this cyclical approach that we are proposing. So part one of the guidance itself sets out the key elements of recovery preparedness. So that's the underpinning issues that national governments, national frameworks needs to be put in place. It's the roles and responsibilities, it's the governance arrangements, it's the international cooperation. So it's these foundation level underpinning matters that really need to be set out before the detailed planning can take place. The next phase as part of that is the objectives for recovery. So these are really clear set objectives that you need to put in place. And the NEA advocates that these are set into 3 areas. So that's ensuring health and well-being, supporting the economy, and protecting the environment. And these will then enable you to put in place the detailed recovery arrangements that will take place as part of planning. And that is then part 3, which I will discuss on the next slide. So once all these are put in place and your planning arrangements are put together, that's when you can start learning from experience. So you can play your exercises, you can test them, hopefully not in incidents, but it gives you the opportunity to learn, to refine, to define your objectives again, to inform more, and to go into a bit more depth around the planning arrangements there. So part 3 itself, as we said, so this is set out in 2 parts. So we've got the cross-cutting issues which are applicable to all parts of recovery, and also all different types of hazards as well. So there's mainly the stakeholder engagement and communication, so that covers things like what's set out in the ICRP 146, so that's co-expertise process, other parts of communication, stakeholder engagement as well there. And then the next part is building resilience. So this is a more general chapter in itself, and it sets out what you need to do in terms of assessing resources, capacity within your country, looking at how you'd set out training programs, how you'd set out exercising programs for recovery as well there. The next part is the more topical issues. So these are the ones that are more specific to nuclear and radiological emergencies. And within this, we've specified that this covers food and drinking water management, remediation and decontamination, radioactive waste management, environmental monitoring, and dose assessment. So take one of these, for example, so radioactive waste management. Within that section, we advocate a proportional approach to recovery planning and waste management planning. So you would target the issues that would need early action in terms of waste management. So be that characterization, be that temporary storage, setting up staging areas, and then the longer term issues which may cover things like waste disposal. You might set out the ideas behind where you might consider waste disposal, but because of the uncertainty involved with the types of waste that you might be faced with, the volumes of waste you might be faced with, it's harder to target that in the preparedness phase. So it's target the early issues and then consider the longer term issues, and giving yourself a process to enable you to do that at the time. So that's the guidance itself, and that one's launched. And then the next phase, as with any good emergency planning cycle and incident management cycle, you would then test that through an exercise. And we are going to test it through INEX 6. So the INEX series, which is the flagship exercise of the Working Party, has been running since 1993, and it's got a long history of testing key issues. And for INEX 6, based on the views of the committee and members, we're going to focus that on the long-term recovery phase. And this is something that I'm personally quite excited about, because it's the first time internationally that longer-term recovery phase will be tested through an exercise. So that's a good one to get involved in. So just a bit in terms of the scope of the exercise and what it will be about. So we're going to run it as tabletop exercises. It's going to be a modular format. We're really keen on developing a package so that if countries can't participate on the time, they can roll it out at another phase, or if countries want to test it again in another area or another place, they can do that. So it's a package that we can reuse because it's very rare that you get the opportunity to test recovery there. Other things, it will begin on the termination of the emergency, so that's the scenario, and then it will be built on the previous experience from other INEX exercises. In terms of what it won't do, it won't test all elements of the long-term recovery. That's quite difficult and it's quite a complex topic, and it's not going to be a very technical scenario. We'll keep it qualitative in that sense there. The modules that we'll be focusing on specifically for the exercise in the modular approach, so we're going to do health aspects, food safety, remediation and decontamination, and waste management. And across all of those are the cross-cutting issues that we've heard a lot about this week. So be that stakeholder engagement, communications, and they're built into every element of the topical issues that we're going to test throughout the exercise there. In terms of the timeline, we're hoping to run the exercise itself in the first part of 2024. I want to open it up to countries to run their modules throughout that time, and the next phase will be planning that up until the 2024 kickoff for that. And just a bit of thanks to the members of the recovery management group. They're very good help and very good contribution. And then also we've got the INEX 6 planning group that are underway at the moment, and it's with thanks to them that we're going to push forward the exercise. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next speaker that talk about the related topics about reality in Fukushima recovery process, what happened in the Fukushima area, the recovery process, and focusing on health issues. Next speaker is Professor Masaharu Tsubokura. He's a professor of Fukushima Medical University. He will talk about overview of secondary health issues after Fukushima accident. Please take.
Thank you, Chair, for your kind introduction. My name is Tsubokura from Fukushima Medical University at the Department of Radiation Health Management. Today, my presentation is about the overview of the secondary, the non-radiological health issues after the Fukushima incident. As a medical doctor working for more than 11 years in Fukushima, we have confronted lots of various health issues after the nuclear incident. And these health issues could be classified into 3 categories depending on when they appear. In the days to the weeks period, of course, radiation exposure is the most important health issue, but in addition to that, trauma and injury were observed, and as you may know, evacuation of the vulnerable, very weak people, the population was immense, a very important problem. And the medical infrastructure was closed and stopped, and a lot of people were moved to the evacuation shelters, and such as infection control and the very privacy-less area was a very important issue. And a lot of people developed the disaster-induced hypertension, the thrombosis, the heart diseases, and the strokes and insomnias, which were life-threatening. In the months and the years period, the mental health and the psychological diseases were observed, such as the PTSDs and depressions, lifestyle diseases such as obesity, the diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemias were also important, and the people could not go to the hospital regularly due to the lack of access to these facilities. And the decline in the rate of the regular medical health checkups were observed, and a lot of people lived in the temporary housing with a very limited area. And in this period, many decontamination workers, reconstruction workers were moved to the Fukushima prefecture, and these health issues among these people were also important. In the several years later, the changes in the social and familial environment were consolidated, And the collapse of the long-term health care was also important. And a lot of younger generation were evacuated. The society got old, and the population decreased, and the social isolation was also the problem. And in the long term, the prejudice and the discriminations were the most important issue which we are confronting now. I will not spend the time to explain every of them, but I will go into detail some of them. In the days and the weeks period, the evacuation is the most important issue. While evacuation is necessary to reduce the dose of radiation, the risk of death among the residents of nursing home increased after the evacuation. In the Minamisoma city, which is located 10 to 30 kilometers away from the nuclear power plant, the death risk was elevated by a factor of 3. And a lot of people died. 25% of residents died within 90 days after the evacuation. And the hospital staff decreased and evacuated. And you can see the survival curve on your right side. And the death rate increased after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant incident. And the human resources were we ran short of the human resources. In addition to that, the people were afraid of going into the disaster-affected area, and we have also confronted with the shortage of material resources. And the main reason why the medical staff could not stay was not from radiation, but because they couldn't maintain their daily activities. And if someone choose to stay inside the disaster-affected area, actually the death rate, the risk of death elevated even when they stayed inside the evacuation zone due to the lack of the medical resources. And if you want to see the detailed case report of the hospital evacuations, you can see these differences. And this situation is quite similar to the COVID-19 pandemic situation with very limited resources, limited material human resources. When we go to the months and years, the period, the Fukushima Medical University is running Fukushima Health Management Survey. This survey consists of the 5 big surveys, and I will explain two of them. On your left side, this is the result of the mental health status among the affected people. And in the year of the accident, approximately 15% of the affected people developed the depression and PTSDs, but this number decreased year after year, and currently the number is around 5. But this number is still somewhat higher than the national average of 3%. On your right side, this is a result of the lifestyle disease survey. And the diabetes is one of the big issues because even in 10 years after the incidence of diabetes continuously went up. We could not see the decrease of the incidence of the diabetes. And the diabetes, as you know, diabetes will lead the heart diseases, the strokes, and in addition to that, incidence of cancer will increase by the development of diabetes. So, in terms of loss of life expectancy, the risk of death due to evacuation was approximately 400 times higher than the risk associated with radiation exposure in a city of 10 to 30 kilometers away from the nuclear power plant. And second, the risk of death due to diabetes, lifestyle diseases, was approximately 40 times higher than the risk of death from radiation exposure. And the risk of death due to the loss of medical health checkups for a few years after the incident was approximately 5 to 10 times higher than the risk of death due to radiation. Of course, the 440, 5 to 10, these numbers will be totally different depending on the size of the the situation of the nuclear emergency, the level of contamination, and the dose of the radiation. But we have to see the optimization needs to be constantly balanced with the changing health issues of each period. I mean, days to weeks, months to years, and several years later after the nuclear incident. And when I go to the several years later period, the discrimination and prejudice is the most important. And the Ministry of the Environment launched the Google project, the Google project. The Fukushima Medical University is very much involved in this project now. As you may know, that when we ask the Tokyo people, the people outside of the Fukushima prefecture, asking whether the genetic effect will occur among the Fukushima people in the future, more than 40% of people will answer the probability is high or very, very high. This situation is, somewhat contradictory to the result of the dose, those and the unscale report, but a lot of people still think of that. And so the Ministry of Environment is trying to reduce the number from 40% to 20% in these 5 years. And this project is made up of 5 subgroup projects, and I don't have much time to explain in details about that. But I'm not sure that this type of discrimination and prejudice will have actual health impact on children in the Fukushima prefecture, but of course these problems are very important in the future. So again, today I presented the various health issues after the nuclear incident, and a lot of secondary non-radiological health issues appeared, and these issues were classified into the 3 categories depending on when they appear. And optimization needs to be constantly balanced with the changing health issues of each period after the nuclear incident. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So our next speaker is Deborah Quayle. Deb is Chief Radiation Health Assessment Division, Radiation Protection Bureau in Health Canada. And Deb's going to be talking to us about adapting to prevailing circumstances, thoughts on modifying protection strategies during COVID-19. The floor is yours, Deb.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. As Ed mentioned, I'll be talking about adapting to prevailing circumstances, so modifying strategies for nuclear emergency response during COVID-19. I think we'll see a lot of overlapping themes from the previous talk. The difference will be that the previous talk was real world. Mine is much more theoretical. And I'll note that the thoughts that inspired this presentation were thought during the early days of COVID-19. So I'll ask you to cast your mind back to April 2020, at the time when after weeks and months of rumbling about a pandemic were realized. The pandemic was real, but we had no real strategies or resources to deal with it at the time. So it was a scary time. A little bit of context. In 2018, Health Canada issued a guidance document for nuclear emergency planning and response. It provided dose-based criteria for off-site protective actions to protect the public, and modeled on IAEA's GSR-7. When the pandemic hit in 2020 and Canadians were told to prepare, we started thinking about just how we might adapt that guidance for the new environment. And I'll mention that in Canada, off-site nuclear emergency response is led by provincial emergency management organizations. These emergency folks were swamped with the pandemic, so we couldn't properly consult with them. So as a result, I can just call this a thought experiment. This is not a well socialized plan at all. However, we did recognize that the prevailing circumstances that we had anticipated when we drafted our guidance document were not what was happening in the world. These are some examples of the protective measures that were in place in Ontario at the time. They look very familiar to most of us, I'm sure. So sheltering in place was important. Social distancing was a thing, a new thing for most of us. Hand hygiene was a big deal, but hand sanitizer was in very short supply. Frequent cleaning of surfaces was still required, as fomite transmission was still in the mix as a possible way that COVID was spreading. Nobody really knew at the time how it spread. Travel restrictions were in place, including domestic travel restrictions. So in Ontario, you were not allowed to go move between communities because they were worried about swamping local health authorities. Mass gatherings were completely prohibited, and PPE was in very short supply. So in the unlikely event that there were concurrent emergencies, a pandemic and a nuclear emergency, clearly these restrictions would have to be taken into account, and some of these are going to conflict with routine protective actions like evacuation. This is just a fairly simple review of some of the risks that we were thinking about. So for COVID, hundreds of people were in hospital in Ontario at the time. That number was increasing every day, and people were dying. Lots of people were dying every day. For a nuclear accident, on the other hand, off-site, the risk we were looking at was a possibility of a few additional cancers over the next 10 to 30 years. No immediate deaths were anticipated from the radiation exposure. COVID as well, it retains the potency over time, at least that's what was thought, and it might even have gotten worse over time. We weren't sure which way the mutations were going to go. Radioactive contamination, on the other hand, it dilutes, decays. And then in terms of scale, COVID was global. A nuclear accident, by comparison, was more regional, a little bit smaller, which is unusual to say. So these are some of the resources that we looked at to adapt our plans. We looked to credible sources for emerging information. We looked to the WHO. We looked to Canadian public health authorities. We also obviously looked at the existing plans and arrangements for nuclear emergency response. We focused on those nuclear power plants in major urban settings because that's where we thought the most crowding, the most need for people to congregate would happen. Fortunately, potassium iodide is pre-distributed in some of those areas, and there's extra stock available, so we were able to factor that in. We also looked at atmospheric dispersion modeling from some recent studies and exercises. So I'll stress these were not the official planning bases. These were things that had come up from exercises, but that was what we had on hand. Looking at it, the deterministic effects off-site were extremely unlikely. Exceeding the generic criterion for evacuation, though, so 100 millisieverts in 7 days, the worst case scenario with a big source term and very bad weather, was not impossible that would happen. But unlikely beyond a couple of kilometers from the accident site. And then exceeding the generic criteria for potassium iodide was definitely possible. Again, with the wrong kind of weather, could be some kilometers downrange. However, most of the time for most people, sheltering in place would be fine. So what did we recommend? We did not recommend any changes to the generic criteria. So they're listed up there. They're the same as they are in GSR 7. What we did recommend was increasing the reference level. This would not significantly change the potential health consequences from the nuclear event, but by allowing people to get a little bit more dose, authorities could move a little more slowly, they could have more time and some more flexibility to actually manage the COVID hazards more safely. That was our thinking. And then along with this, we recommended some changes to the way protective actions were actually implemented. So a bit more specifics on that. We recommended that evacuation should not be initiated until authorities could be confident that evacuees had somewhere to go where they were not at an elevated risk of either spreading COVID or getting COVID. So no arenas, no community centers, none of these big gathering areas. We recommended that decisions on evacuation post-release should be based on measurements. Evacuations or relocations, I should say there. We also recommended not evacuating entire sectors based on a couple of measurements, but being a bit more surgical in the approach. Registration, obviously quite important for everybody, especially if they're staying home and getting some dose. If it was possible to register them online from home, that was strongly encouraged. Preparing people to self-decontaminate as opposed to showing up at a decontamination center, or actively discouraging anyone from self-presenting at a medical facility because they were already swamped. We didn't need more people. Obviously, if somebody was really injured, like an on-site person, that would be a different story. But in this case, we're talking about the public off-site. And we recommended against relocating anybody who's at high risk from COVID-19, so that includes seniors, people with pre-existing health conditions, but there would be a need, as we heard, a need to ensure that these people would have caregivers staying behind with them. In terms of population monitoring, we recommended accepting that a little bit of radioactive contamination is probably better than some contamination from active coronavirus. So limiting monitoring, at least the short-term, immediate monitoring to people who were suspected to be at significant risk. On the flip side, though, we'd be looking at more longer-term monitoring, like stretched out over weeks and months for some, based on reconstruction, dose reconstruction. So those would be people who, when you do the math, appear to have an internal dose that's approaching the threshold for medical management, or even an irradiation dose, I suppose. And then also we would make that available, we would think, to others for assurance, because the mental health stress would be quite significant in this case. And again, registration would be key. When we look at off-site emergency workers and helpers, obviously PPE should be appropriate for all the recognized hazards. So that's the radioactive contamination, that's the COVID, that's the hazards associated just with working in PPE. We recommended trying to limit use of medical grade PPE because, as I said, it was in very short supply at the time. We recognized that if people were going to stay in place, there might be a need for more workers and helpers in order to support them, especially if we're distributing KI or something like that. We also recognized that it would be difficult, potentially, especially for just-in-time training, to coordinate or train or inform these emergency workers and helpers if you can't bring them all together in a group. So even in April 2020, there were some decent web-based tools around, so we recommended using those wherever possible, and then doing training in small groups where you could maintain social distancing where it was not possible. Unfortunately, March and April in Ontario is still pretty cold, so there's limits to what you can do outside. And individuals who are at high risk of COVID should not serve as emergency workers or helpers. Public communication, clearly a very important piece of this, and I admit it's touched on quite lightly. But obviously it would be effective, open, transparent communication would be absolutely essential. It's worth noting that the public quickly became used to almost non-stop information about COVID. Our Prime Minister was on TV every day talking about it. I'm sure it was the case in many countries. So nuclear emergency communications would have to match that pace and that profile. And in particular, the rationale behind any of the deviations that we've made from the published plans and procedures, they would need to be explained clearly and as soon as possible. So in conclusion, we felt that the public protection strategies for nuclear emergencies developed prior to the onset of COVID-19 were not optimized for execution during the pandemic, especially the early days when we just didn't have the tools to cope with COVID. The public acceptability of the revised recommendations could have, almost definitely would have been a significant challenge. And I'll say the prevailing circumstances have changed again since April 2020, so the recommendations today would be quite different. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to introduce the next speaker. Our next speaker up is Kathleen Heppel-Maces. Kathleen's the Director General, Directorate of Security and Safeguards at our national regulator, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. Kathleen is going to be speaking to us on nuclear emergency management and preparedness in Canada, optimization through resiliency. Kathleen, the floor is yours, whatever you like.
This is on?
I believe.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to participate to this event. So, as you know, the integrated nuclear sector is a complex socio-technological system, which needs to ensure the healthy interactions of its fundamental components. Its many organizations, whether the operator, local or provincial or federal governments, in our case in Canada, its people, staff, and citizens, its processes and the technologies. The interactions and communications occur within a space of beliefs and of assumptions, the culture. Whether during normal operations or during the phase of emergency preparedness, response, or recovery efforts, the interactions of these components will play a crucial role and yield results that ultimately will have a major impact on the health and safety. History has shown that one must be ready for the known, the unknown, and the unexpected. We must also have good process and procedures to assure a predictable outcome, but also maintain the agility, knowledge, and skills when facing unexpected situations to truly sustain a resilient system, to save lives, whether from the impact of radiation exposure or from perceived risk, rooted in beliefs. I forgot to remove this thing. So I'm not as resilient as I wanted to be. I'm apologizing for this. So effective preparedness, response arrangements, and capabilities are essential to minimize the impacts of nuclear and radiological events and emergency on the health and safety in the environment. CNSC, my organization, as you heard from the President this morning, conducts the regulatory oversight of nuclear facility, its emergency preparedness program, and operates its own emergency operations center. My plan today is to speak about how emergency preparedness has been enhanced since the events related to Fukushima, how we have ensured that we subject ourselves to international peer reviews, and have learned from other opportunities. That's better. The first example is how we've learned many things from the Fukushima accident. The primary means of preventing and mitigating the consequence of accidents is first through the design and operation of a nuclear power plant. Adequate safety functions that are independent and redundant to ensure nuclear safety in order to assure controls of the facility, its cooling, its containment of all radioactive substance, and avoid any dose on-site or certainly off-site. I'm referring here to the concept of defense in depth, which is necessary to minimize any release of radioactive material. There are 5 levels necessary to assure the nuclear safety. The 5th one is emergency preparedness. After the Fukushima event, regulatory agencies, operators, and the international community worked together and have reinforced this approach after the events to enhance all the levels. Human and organizational factors, new technologies and their interactions were improved to strengthen the framework, whether for existing facilities, but also setting the platform for new facilities. In our case, for example, the emergency preparedness was strengthened. For example, the automatic potassium iodine tablets were pre-distributed in the 10-kilometer range for all the facilities. On-site measures as well were taken regarding the procurement of additional emergency management equipment. So many things were done. Another opportunity to learn and to strengthen our system was also during a commission hearing of the Pickering relicensing facility. Members of the public came to the commission to express concerns about their prompt access to potassium iodine tablet within the 10 to 50 kilometer range, which we call the ingestion zone. The communities were expressing lack of understanding and information on the access to those tablets, including schools and school boards. During the commission, the operators and province and others were unable to bring the necessary clarity. The commissions had concern, and the CNSC staff proposed the formation of a working group bringing together all the levels of governments to bring clarity to this issue. Members of civil society also wanted to participate, and as a result, we created an advisory committee which provided them a space where they felt included and heard and provided input on the result of the working group. This engagement with these communities was very beneficial for those aspects. For the next phase of this work, which phase 1 has been completed and presented to the Commission in January, the next phase, we will now have the province lead this next step, as per its jurisdiction, so this is a good news story. I will have learned for the future. Another big opportunity for learning was the emergency preparedness review mission that we hosted in Canada in 2019. An important aspect of this mission was to consider Canada's preparedness to emergency irrespective of the initiating event. The ICRP mission, we were really glad, confirmed that Canada was successful in its implementation of the IAEA safety standards, GSR Part 7, that Deborah referred to. Beyond the conclusion, this very positive conclusion, there was also an additional great benefit. The process of preparation as a national team brought, in my view, the most beneficial aspect, which was the relationship. As they say, it's not during an emergency that you start exchanging business cards. You need to do that well ahead of that time. So this opportunity for working together extensively provided that additional benefit. Not only that, we've also embraced the opportunity to learn and have created an action plan. And now we are in a position to host the follow-up mission, which we will do so in next summer in 2023. Again, this is a national commitment. Such things that we heard about, for example, I mentioned irrespective of any events, the peer review mission highlighted the importance to also practice emergencies triggered by a security event. So we did one of them last year regarding a cybersecurity event. We also received a good practice on communication. Keep that in mind for a minute. Let me talk about the next learning opportunity. So, Sunday morning, cold January, freezing rain day, Sunday morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, 7:12 to be more precise. There was an event that woke up Ontarians in Canada, and on their phone showed up this alert. This alert says, don't worry, there's a nuclear emergency, don't worry, stay home, basically. What do? Most people are sleeping or kind of sleepy. So what happened there is that there was a message sent in error during a routine shift change at the Provincial Emergency Operations Center. This was done unknowingly as the operator, the alert system platform has two spaces. One is testing and one is the live platform. And the operator unknowingly sent a message on the live system, but thought it was actually on the testing system. So all Ontarians are waking up to this alert, and also to add to the situation, the system was rather new. There was no procedures to recall an alert, causing delays. There was no process of decision-making. There basically was an inability to make a timely decision, inability to show agility and resilience. It took 108 long minutes before the second alert was sent to notify the public in error. I'm shortening the story here, of course, for the purpose of this presentation, but the next alert the next information came from the operator, subsequently from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, but that came in other form of communication. This system of communication, which is the alert that goes on all phones, was not recalled until 108 minutes later. So you can imagine the population trying to make sense of it. Most people thought it did not make sense, but some got really concerned. And so there was confusion, and also people got scared as a result. At the CNSC, we took this to heart. We did not perform that well either. Our website, which had been a credible source of information during the Fukushima accident, we had gained a reputation to be an excellent source provider, credible source of information. But so many visitors came to our website in that short period of time, the website crashed. Not a good news. So we then scrambled to do our job. How are we going to do this? We are the regulatory authority. We are to inform the public. And we have built that trust. It takes a lot of effort. So we eventually sent out tweets, message, and social media. They needed to be, well, initially it was perceived that they needed to be bilingual, and there was also a hesitancy in the sense that it should be the province recalling this message, not us. Yet our duty officer, who had been very quick on his feet, knew right away that this was a false alert. So with that in mind, we took actions and have taken big steps in improving our decision-making and communication in that sense. Just noting the light here. And so, in a nutshell, to make emergency preparedness more resilient, engagement with the public and Indigenous is key, certainly to be locally. We need to ensure we validate our approaches, consider multiple scenarios, and ensure we remain agile and be ready for unexpected situations. Optimizing for resilience and emergency preparedness is key. We must be ready to learn, remain humble, and continue to set up a solid emergency management framework that can be applied to existing and new technology in order to build resilience in our preparedness. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to next speaker. Next speaker will make a virtual presentation. She's Momo Takada from Japan, the National Institute, Advanced Industrial Science and Technology. She is now a mentee of the ICRP Task Group 114, and she talked about the impact of the contamination in farmland and the forest and the rebuilding returnees' lives after the Fukushima accident.
Hello everyone, I'm Momo Takada from National Institute of Advanced Industrial Science and Technology, Japan. I'd like to talk about decontamination of the environment after Fukushima accident and rebuilding of returnees' lives. Decontamination of the environment after a large nuclear accident. In ICRP publication 146, the removal of contamination from surfaces and soils can be a very effective action to reduce exposure. However, decontamination of the environment has the potential to lead the production of contaminated waste, often in large quantities. In General Safety Guide of IAEA, during optimization of protection and safety, other radiological and non-radiological factors should also be considered, with an aim to optimize below the reference level. It means that the negative impact should be smaller than the intended benefit, considering various factors. My talk is about environmental decontamination in Fukushima, especially regarding farmland and forest. What were the benefits and negative impacts besides reduced exposure and waste generation? This is based on our study in one rural community. This is a real overview. Main industry is agriculture, such as tobacco, flour, and rice cultivation. Evacuation period was from 2011 to 2017 for 6 years. Return rate of residents is below 30%, mainly elderly people. Farmland decontamination was removal of topsoil. Forest decontamination was removal of organic materials on forest floor within 20 meters from residential areas. My talk is the result of our qualitative study. We conducted semi-structured interviews with 10 returnees in 2019. We recorded the interviews and transcribed it, then analyzed it in qualitative manners using the SCAT technique. Next, I'll show what they said from several aspects of decontamination impacts on the returnees. First, situation after the return. Before the accident, the interviewees were full-time farmers, part-time farmers, or others. After their return, some have resumed their businesses to the same level as before the accident. However, the majority have reduced the size of farming or stopped completely. Their perception of the village are a mixture of safe and unsafe areas in the village. Safe area is decontaminated and unsafe area is not. Air dose level, this is external exposure, is generally fine, but some are still concerned about future effects of radiation. Farm crops are safe because of decontamination, but wild foods from forests are still contaminated. I'd like to share the significance of the decontamination. First, it mitigated the disgust of living with contaminants. One returnee said, at the very least, I don't want radioactive materials to exist around my house. Others said, normally radioactive materials do not exist around us, then it should be removed. The decontamination was also motivation to restart their life and help to regain self-confidence in their hometown. One returnee said, I want to throw out the dirty stuff and start fresh with a clean slate. Others said, I came back because the environment is good. It means decontamination was finished. Without decontamination, my grandchildren would not come to my village. As to decontamination of the farmland, safety after the resumption of farming is the top priority. Removing topsoil is widely accepted in the community. In their context, safe does not simply mean meeting requirements, it has a more complex meaning. One returnee said, the government is satisfied by confirming below the standard, but the farmers are not. A matter is how consumers feel. The returnees were under pressure not to have cesium detected in their crops once they resumed farming. Only one failure would damage not only themselves but the entire community, and it would prevent the community from recovering. One returnee said, if cesium is detected in my crops, my community will lose sales. One failure would be the end of everything. In case of forest, in contrast to farmlands, we had complicated feelings. Many returnees were confused why the decontamination was only 20 meters from the residential area instead of the area used before the accident. At the same time, they understand that forest decontamination is not so cost-effective and there is a trade-off between benefit and risks such as landslide. Accordingly, they understood that they must give up with moderate decontamination. One returnee said, decontamination of mountain is difficult. If done incorrectly, landslide may occur during heavy rains. Some returnees showed decreasing enthusiasm to forest decontamination over time, saying, I don't care anymore, I don't need to go into the forest. This is a part of what we obtained through the interviews, and here I compiled a matrix of benefit and negative impacts of the decontamination. It includes other contents besides what I shared today. For example, one of the negative impacts of the decontamination in the region is that it may have prolonged the evacuation, resulting in the low return rate. Other negative impacts of farmland is declining the quality of agricultural environment. A negative impact about forests is the loss of traditional forest use due to the incomplete decontamination. This is the last slide. One of the limitations of a study is that this is from one region, but there are no comparisons and we cannot conclude that the results are robust. However, it is an important fact that our analysis clarified the qualitative impact of decontamination on returnees' lives, and quantitative studies cannot provide such kind of information. This is a summary of our study. The decontamination of farmland and forest boosted the motivation to rebuild returnees' lives. Sometimes the negative effects can be offset. This does not mean that large-scale environmental decontamination should always be done at great expense, but I would like to emphasize that the decontamination not only reduces exposure and generated waste, but has not so small and different impacts on individual lives. I'd like to conclude with a message that such variety of individual impacts also need to be considered in environmental decontamination and also in preparedness for nuclear accident. Thank you very much.
Okay, our final speaker of this session is Helen Moyse. Helen is a defense scientist in the Autonomous and Radiological Technology section of Defense R&D Canada. And Helen is going to be speaking to us on radiological training for the defense sciences, a unique playing field. Helen, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction. So my name is Helen Moyse. So I am a defense scientist in radiation with development research in Defense Canada. So my goal in today's presentation is to give you an overview of who we are at DRDC, what we do as part of the Radiological and Nuclear Technologies Group at DRDC, what our R&D defense program is about, our capabilities, the challenges and consideration, especially when we're training within the defense sciences. And I'd like to conclude with giving you an overview of our future work and considerations. So who we are. So Defense Research and Development Canada, also known as DRDC, we are part of the Department of National Defense. So our goal is to support the CAF, the Canadian military. And in order to do that, we have various roles. So we support Canada's operation, both in defense and security, both here at home and abroad. And we also work with national, public safety and security communities in achieving our support for Canada. So while we have various roles, so one of these roles, for example, might be the implementation of scientific and technical solutions to the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces. We also provide various roles in working with other agencies and the federal departments such as the CNSC, Health Canada, and so on. The structure of DRT in providing this support and expertise to the government and to the Canadian Armed Forces, it comprises of several research centers that spans across Canada. So our headquarters are based in Ottawa, and we have 7 research centers from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, and each DRDC center specializes in a particular area of research. So in this presentation, I'd like to introduce you to the DRDC Suffield, Alberta Research Center. This is where we house the CBRNE program, and this is where we house the Radiological and Nuclear Defense program. So DRDC Suffield, Alberta is located on the Canadian Forces Base. So this is the largest military training ground in Canada. To give you an approximate size of how large this base is, it's about 4 to 5 times the size of Toronto. As part of this base, we also have housed the Counterterrorism and Technology Center. So this is the center that the Government of Canada enacted after the 9/11 event. So we do house a lot of CBRNE activities and expertise within the center and at DRDC Suffield. So the R&D Defense program is developed by the Radiological and Nuclear Technologies Group. And what we do is, as part of our priorities, in order to support the Canadian Armed Forces, is that we provide immediate reach-back support to the CAF. We also provide evidence-based and scientific support, as well as scientific advice. For example, we can provide for them support and advice into what types of radiation detection equipment might be best suitable for them out in the field, what best would work for them on their missions. We also provide advice for them in terms of radiation protection from our hazard, threat assessment, risk assessment. We also provide a tech watch for them. So we're always looking at the market for novel radiation detection development and perform the evaluations on site for them. One of the concerns that the military has is radiological contamination of sensitive equipment. For example, the weapon component, rifles, scopes, and communication devices. So one of the research areas that our group does is look into decontamination methods in order to provide suitable methods to decontaminate sensitive equipment. So our capabilities, in addition to these priorities, is very unique. The first one is, based on the size of the land, we have access to about 470 square kilometers of experimental proving ground, which means that we can do a very unique, large-scale radiological field experiments out on base. In addition to the large radiological field trials, we also have small-scale and also additional facilities on base. For example, we do have a gamma cell irradiator. We do have expanding resources and expanding building to look into radiological identification, for example, looking into shielding algorithms, and we're looking into gamma spec decontamination and future consideration work in expanding within radiation protection and also rapid field dosimetry. We also do modeling. Another part of our capability that's different from the civilian side of radiation is that we are not governed by the CNSC. So we have our own federal regulatory body. And our federal regulatory body is called the Director of Nuclear Safety, or DNSAFE. And as part of DNSAFE, in essential, it regulates all the nuclear and radiological activities for the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces. That's not to say that we don't follow the guidelines, the radiation protection guidelines of the CNSC, ICRP, and so on. It just means that we have our own regulatory body, and that means that we can do work that no one else can do, or we can acquire radiological nuclides, radiological material that might not be permissible by other departments or organizations within Canada. And that's because we're the nature of working with defense sciences. So when we're doing live radiological training, the purpose of this is to impart knowledge and training to our, not only Canadian Armed Forces, but to emergency first responders. So our main priority, our main goal in delivering this live radiation training is that we want to develop the competency and the skill and the competence of our military and also our first responders who come to us for training. In order to do that, we have to provide a realistic-based scenario. So these realistic-based scenarios might be in real-life situations. For example, radiological threat, they should be able to have the confidence and ability to be able to deal with those situations should they occur. The radiological training, some of the clients and some of the groups that come to us for training, in addition to the Canadian Armed Forces, they have included our international allies, the countries from the NATO. So between 9 to 10 countries, the UK, Australia, USA, and so on, they come to us. So every July, annually, we host the NATO chemical response under the CBRNE response exercise. So we get about 300 to 400 soldiers on base that train under the CBRNE umbrella. We also have trained the German Army Medical Group, and we also train those activities sponsored by Global Affairs Canada. And we also work with public security and safety communities. So we have trained, for example, the National Response Team and the Federal Assessment Team, and we also hold emergency response exercises using provincial, local, and other federal regulation departments. So when we talk about the radiation training field exercises, there are several components that we want them to get competency and to develop their skills in. So when we're designing these radiation field exercises, we're looking at surveying, recon, we're looking at risk assessment. Are they able to do a simple background reading, a background survey? Are they able to do a T survey? How do they approach the radiological scenarios? Are they able to determine what is the risk? So these are preliminary surveys. The next one we want to look at is look at RDDs or RDDs. Are they confident enough to know how to approach this? Are they able to set up their hot zone, their cold zone, their warm zone? Do they know where they're supposed to set up their decon line? We also try to teach them how to do sampling and identification. Are they able to take radiological samples of suspected materials? Are they able to identify those samples out of the hot zone within their reach-back capability team? We also look at site remediation. So they're not only responding to the radiological scenario and assessing it, but they should be able to mitigate the scene. Are they able to do that? Are they able to use their radiation protection principle, the shielding, whatever they have available to them? So don't forget, in a radiological scenario, the training, we try to reflect real-life scenarios, so they won't have on-site shielding, whatever they need in order to mitigate the scene. So we try to develop those skills and competencies. We also try to teach them how to operate in a radiological field. That means being able to use their own radiation detection equipment and understand what those readings mean. And should they malfunction, what's the next steps that they should do? Decontamination. We want to teach them how to set up their decon line, how to check their own equipment for contamination, their personnel, their team members for contamination. So these are all important aspects we try to cover and we include during their radiological training. So one of the challenges and considerations that we have are many. First one, we have to consider what the level of knowledge and expertise of the group that is coming to us are. Do they have any knowledge of radiation principles, or are they advanced enough? So when we have these radiation training styles, we tend to develop 4 different kinds of training styles. The first one, the most basic one, is called lead training. And this is where we guide them step by step in approaching a scenario, assessing the scenario, how to use the radiation detection equipment, and so on. So all of these scenarios, we incorporate both theoretical classroom instruction and also on-the-field practical instruction. And these use real-life sources. So nothing is falsified, and they're supposed to mimic real-life situation. We also have something called in and out training. In and out training is when the team gets a little bit more independent. So we watch them, assess the situation, and perform a specific task. That can also be done with assessment scenarios, where we step aside, let the team do what they want, and evaluate them in terms of their response. However, one of the challenges and considerations when we act as assessors of a DRCC assessing them, we have to consider that each country, they typically have their own standard operating protocol, their own procedures, and how they assess a radiological scenario. So typically, we ask the client and those types to offer their own assessor, because the DRCC, Canada might have their own criteria versus in other countries. Full exploitation scenarios are those that typically run over a multitude of days, for example, during NATO. And in full exploitation scenarios, sometimes we go a bit more advanced. We can include nuclear forensics. There can also be intelligent briefings or intelligence. So for example, a scenario can mimic a terrorist lab. And in that way, the military police will get involved and practice their intelligent briefing, intelligent collections, and so on. So when we consider all the components and the expertise, the knowledge, we have other factors for ourselves, for DRCC, our program, to consider. That includes the transport of materials. It also includes the procurement of radiological materials. While we have our own vast inventory of radionuclides, from the smallest check sources to a large in the range of terabecquerels, sometimes we have to consider whether there is a specific radionuclide that that training group might require. As such, we'll have to apply for permission from DNSAFE in order to acquire that. The turnover to acquire those depends on what is needed. Usually approval is very fast compared to the civilian side, just because of the nature of our training. We also work with external organizations, external providers, in order to acquire those radioisotopes. Also, the time of the year. July is our very busy time of the year because this is when NATO occurs. So we typically don't have other training groups coming in. Requirements for uses of neutrons. We do use neutrons also as part of our training. We also have shared facilities between multiple groups. So sometimes training groups will want a combination of a radiological threat to be in combination with a chemical threat or a biological threat. So we do have expertise in other sections to work with. So all these factors and all these challenges take into account the DRCC personnel. We have to have DRCC personnel that are qualified to act as radiation safety officers, to act as radiation access controllers as well. We also have regulatory considerations. Because we're doing these training exercises on the military base, we don't have to worry about the public side of exposure or contamination and so on. So in conclusion, the RNTG, the Radiological and Nuclear Technology Group, is responsible for delivering the RN program. So in essence, we're comprised of a group of defense scientists, each with our own specialty. We also have engineers, radiation safety officers, and as well as research technologists who assist us. So in essence, we exist as a group of subject matter expertise. So our expertise range from radiochemistry, medical and health physics, dosimetry, scientific, and instrumentation. We also have, in addition to radiological training, we also have duties. We also do a lot of research. So some of our research paths are in partnership beyond the Canadian Armed Forces and beyond the Department of National Defense. So we do have collaboration, for example, with academia, with universities. So we are open and willing to work with partners. And some of these collaborations that we're working on, some of the research areas that we're working on, include decontamination, radiological dispersal of large-scale buildings, gamma spectrometry using shielding algorithms to identify hidden radionuclide threats. We also look into radiation detection and development. So we're keen on looking at what new radiation detectors are out there in the market that would be suitable for military needs. So in addition to the research areas and research expertise, given our resources that we have in terms of the inventory of radionuclides, the activities that we're allowed to work with compared to civilian side, which may not be allowed to do these types of things, we are open, and we also entertain requests from outside groups beyond the Canadian Armed Forces and beyond the Department of National Defense to help ensure radiation protection and to advance the knowledge of radiation sciences. So I hope that this was a very brief overview of what we do as a RN program. And we always look forward to hearing from you and developing and fostering partnerships. And with this, I want to thank you all for your time.
Thank you, our speaker. Let's open the question. Please take a microphone. Yeah.
Thank you. Anne Nisbet, UK Health Security Agency and ICRP Committee 4. One quick comment. I think some of the issues that were described by Dr. Takada to do with decontamination after Fukushima, I think that's a really good advert for the paper that Chris Mogg gave about the NEA framework for recovery preparedness, and certainly the section on remediation and decontamination would help avoid some of the adverse outcomes that was described. In terms of a question, Jean-Francois, so excellent guidance for protecting responders following a large nuclear accident. So how applicable do you think that guidance would be for a malicious event where there isn't on-site, off-site circumstances? And leading on from that, are reference levels really enough when sending responders into the hot zone?
Could you repeat, please?
So, all of it. Okay. So the guidance that you described fits very nicely for a large nuclear accident. How applicable is it, do you think, to a malicious event when there isn't on-site, off-site, and we don't necessarily have the same time frame in terms of early, intermediate, and late? And the second part of that question, are reference levels enough when sending responders into a hot zone?
Okay, for the first question, as far as I understood, it is exact that these recommendations are set for a major accident, but we can adapt them for different circumstances as needed. Of course, as far as they are more or less similar. About the reference level, in fact, there is a lot of flexibility for the reference level. I mean, because of this publication is related to a major accident, a very severe accident, the number are the highest possible, I would say. But depending on the circumstances, we have to adapt these references. And of course, for the early phase, we have to take into account what we prepared in advance. But very soon, we are able to adjust the number according to the circumstances. Let me add that this number could be different, either we are on site, off site, and also depending on the area. And again, there is a lot of flexibility about to set the reference level. Hoping I fully heard the question and providing an answer.
Okay, next question. Yep.
I'll try to keep this as brief as possible, not hold anyone up for lunch. So just as a young professional in the field of radiation protection, it's paramount that in addition to ensuring protection for workers and the public through our work, we're also able to demonstrate and convince the public that they are being protected and given accurate information. This was briefly alluded to, how we have to pivot strategies due to what we saw from COVID. A bit louder?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, for sure. Sorry.
Cannot hear.
Sorry. So as was briefly alluded to, we have to pivot strategies as we saw in COVID. So just in terms of restoring, or maybe even just gaining trust in the public from what we would have to communicate in the event of a major nuclear event, is there perhaps, are we confident in the established channels of communication between organizations to ensure that there is congruent messaging as much as possible? And what more could we perhaps be doing in preparation to combat the misinformation campaigns that will surely follow, especially in the age of social media and alternative facts?
Does it work? It's working? Okay. Okay, good, thank you. I don't have a good answer for that. The communications between the organizations, at least within the government, are pretty good. So I'm fairly solid that messaging within the organizations with authority could be made consistent quite quickly. As far as the public, though, and the misinformation, it's not the kind of thing. Well, Kathleen said you can't hand over business cards in the middle of the emergency. I think it's part of an ongoing communications campaign that we really have to do to help put these things in perspective and not treat, say, radon as one silo and emergencies as one silo and planned exposures as one silo, and somehow be able to communicate that there are a number of different circumstances where people are exposed to different levels of radiation, and sometimes it's okay and sometimes it's not, and sometimes more makes sense and sometimes less is unacceptable, and it's not easy, but I think that we can definitely, speaking on behalf of Health Canada and my group anyway, I think we can do a better job of trying to be more, I don't want to use the word holistic, but broader, I guess, in the way that we explain radiation exposure to the Canadian public.
Can you hear me? Just on the communication channels, I think it also extends to between countries as well, and protective actions, because if one country is setting one protective action, another country setting another protective action, you've immediately lost trust. And that was a case that we saw repeated time after time in COVID, and we're still feeling that now. So trying to get that comparison between countries, trying to get that collective message to build trust will really help. So the work is to be done on that and continued.
Excellent, thank you, and thank you for the presentations. They're excellent.
Eduardo, please.
Thank you, Eduardo Gallego from the Technical University of Madrid and Committee 4 of ICRP. My reflection or comment is regarding the presentation by Momo Takada, in which we have seen that even though the optimization of recovery actions is being, let's say, designed correctly, the reference levels are adequate and so on, then the public considers that a single detection of cesium is a failure, total failure of the system. So my reflection is, how should we learn to communicate to the public the importance of the single detection or a reference level? A reference level should not be considered never as the limit between dangerous and safe. It's just a reference. But it's clear that we are failing in communicating that. So it's simply a reflection. I don't know if somebody from the table could give some comment.
Yeah, thank you. Question, comment. Yeah, I sent him hard. This is a very important question. Okay. You.
If I may, yes. You are right, but the reference level is set as, I would say, the relevant envelope for a given situation. And then it is starting point for optimization.
Yes.
It is not at all a tool to give, to say it is good, it is bad. It is just a benchmark, especially in such a situation. And as far as I understood about the concern of the people, it is not, their concern is not a matter of the level of these criterion. What they want is zero pollution. They understand that it is not possible, but they would like that we turn to that, and they would like also that there is a real process in order to improve the situation. If they are not convinced that we have engaged a real process, they will cry, they will claim, whatever the level, the criteria. If they are convinced that we do our best, it is the beginning of a dialogue.
Hopefully. Thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Bob, please.
Thank you. Nobuhiko Ban from Nuclear Regulation Authority, Japan. I have a question to Dr. Tsubokura. You said that in the Fukushima Daiichi accident, the risk of dying from evacuation was 400 times higher than the risk of health effects from the averted dose. It is a shocking number. But as you know well, in the Fukushima Daiichi accident, the government was not prepared, municipality was not prepared, and people were not prepared, of course. And my question is, if we are better prepared, do you think this number can be reduced?
Thank you for your question. Of course, the people were well prepared for the evacuation. This number could be reduced to maybe around 40 or the 20, somewhat 1/10 of the 400 times, in my impression. But actually, the evacuation was inevitable because even if the dose is very low, the fear and the lack of knowledge toward radiation could lead to the disruption of the society, and inevitably, a lot of people, especially within the 30 kilometer, 20 kilometer zone, people will be evacuated, even though the government should not to do so. And so, in my impression, the most safest way is to evacuate very slowly. I mean, the evacuation is not inevitable, but they should not be performed as quickly as possible. So maybe with the very slow evacuation, maybe this 400, this number could be reduced around maybe 40, hopefully 1/10.
Thank you.
Okay, Anaria, short comment, question?
Yes. Analia Canova from the Nuclear Regulatory Authority of Argentina. My question is to Chris about the food strategy. You mentioned that something very important, it has to retain this economical sustainability and also the equity for different populations, not only in the recovery phase, not only in the place of the accident, but in other states and also in the international. So I think we have to think about how the framework should be looking for this trade and this sustainability of economical issue. So what is the framework or what is the philosophy you are suggesting in your document of the NEA to have similar data, similar framework, similar criteria to promote this acceptable of sustainability for the people they produce the food? Which is your concept, your thought about this? Thank you.
Absolutely. So just picking up, that's something that we will hope to test in the exercise. So you've seen it identified as one of the modules of the concept, and obviously we've got the work ongoing at the moment with our expert group on food safety framework, and that's going to be a key topic there that we'll get involved in and make sure that it's tested as well. So we've got the guidance obviously within the framework, within the strategy to keep the sustainability, building consumer confidence, building trust in the food safeties, how you lift food restrictions as well. That's a key topic that we'll pick up and definitely look to test in the exercise. So hopefully to get engaged on that one. Thanks.
Okay, so I've got a few pages of ending remarks, but there is absolutely no way that I'm going to go over them. But I think we've got a lot of food for thought on both sessions about optimization. And my overarching remark, I think, is that optimization, I believe, is an easy concept, but it's hard to execute and it's even harder to quantify. So I think that our speakers have given us some food for thought on various areas related to emergency preparedness, response, and recovery that are very well suited for optimization. So I'd like to thank all the speakers for providing your insights and thank the audience as well for that. Lunch is outside. For CRPA members, if you want to grab your lunch and go to the Seymour room, there's a small get-together. So,
okay.
Are we?
Yeah, thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.